Hello, my name is Kathy Levitt, and I'm here today interviewing Nicolas Noxon on October 5th, 1999 in Los Angeles, California.
Great. Perfect. Okay.
What was your name at birth, and did you have any nicknames?
Well, it was Nicolas Lane Noxon, and I think I was always Nicholas, without an H, because my parents conceived me in France, and there's a French aperitif, which is Nicolas, and I don't know, they like that. And my mother never threw anything away. There's a postcard we found yesterday, and there's the poster. She must have picked it up at the time because it's dated 1935, and I was born in 36.
And then where were you? You were conceived in France. When and where were you born?
London, 1936, July 1936.
And then where did you grow up?
Well, in London and England for about 4 years, and in that time World War II started. My mother was American, my father was Canadian, and they wanted to get out of England for obvious reasons, and they wanted me out especially because they were sure we were going to be bombed to bits. So they sent me when I was 4 in 1940 to the U.S. by myself, to her parents who lived in Falls Church, Virginia. And as they could get passage, they came over, my mother about a year after, and my father about a year after that.
How did they come to be in Europe and then England at that time?
Well, my mother was a painter, and she went over to study, and I think she thought Europe was cool, much cooler than Washington, D.C., where she came from. And my father was, he was sort of an Anglo-Canadian family. He went to Stowe and then to Cambridge, Cambridge intellectual, filmmaker, or more film scholar. But he and Grierson and Basil Wright and that whole bunch were together at Cambridge, and then later were doing things. And my father, when he met my mother, was in the advertising business over there, making advertising shorts for theaters. So they met and married, settled down there, but neither one came from England.
So they sent you at the age of 4 to your maternal grandparents. Can you
Right.
tell me what your mother's name was and her family's name?
Well, she was Betty Lane, my middle name, and my father was Gerald Forbes Noxon, and that was that.
And what was he doing with Grierson?
Well, they were pals, and my father published a little journal at Cambridge called Experiment, which I think really sort of reviewed Grierson's films and helped make him famous. I think my father at that point was more a film promoter than a filmmaker. There are 1 or 2 shorts that I've never seen that you can find on the internet in Paris, in a collection there that have his name on them. But he wasn't as active as a filmmaker as a sort of film intellectual.
And then when you moved to Falls Church, did he stay involved? Was that his life's work?
Well, he came over 2 years, almost 2 years after I left, in middle of the war, and he went to work for CBC in Canada. We went up to near Toronto and spent the rest of the war in Canada. And he did make some films then, one about the Alaskan Highway and so forth for the war effort. And after the war in '46, we moved back down to Cape Cod, and he went to work for Boston University, where he was for the next 35 years.
So then you spent a good part of your childhood in Boston?
Never really in Boston. We bypassed Boston and went to the Cape, and he commuted. But he founded the film school at Boston University, which was then called the School of Public Communications and Public Relations. There was no such thing as film per se, but he was there for a long, long time.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents, from your mother or your father?
Oh. That's a loaded question. Um, I think I got a lot of curiosity from both of them, and probably my outstanding trait is curiosity. I think on my tombstone it should say, "I want to know," and that's almost to a vice. I want to know about everything all the time for the sheer satisfaction of knowing, not necessarily to do anything with it. My father pointed out to me when I was about 18 that I couldn't add even single-digit figures, but I could talk and I could probably write if I ever put my mind to it. And he felt that was in the genes. He was a good writer, and so maybe some visual sense from Mom, sense of humor from her.
Do you have brothers and sisters? And
No, I was the only child.
what were your hobbies growing up?
Variously, model planes, radios, kites, swimming, more model planes, motorcycles, bicycles, motor scooters, sports cars. It was all very mechanical and kind of scientific, and I was not interested in the kind of arts and humanities that my mother and father were involved in, and I always felt I was just a different breed.
Well, when did that change, though? Did it change?
Well, it did change. Yeah, I never really got interested in art. My mother was painting the whole time, or in sort of high culture that my father was involved in. He was a film historian, teaching about classic, can't think of a single film right now, but I woke up to nature anyway, to the natural world, and it finally dawned on me that a tree was a lot more fantastic than an automobile.
How old were you when that happened?
Oh, late teens probably.
What kind of student were you?
Poor. I always struggled. I was good at the thing. I was very lazy. I just was good at the things I did, but I didn't bother with the rest.
So, what did you want to be when you... What were your thoughts about what you wanted to do when you grew up?
Well, airplane pilot. Cowboy. Sounds funny. An astronomer at one point. And anything scientific, but astronomy seemed to be neatest of all. And that's where the math came in, obviously. If I had become an astronomer, I wouldn't have been in the forefront because I had no head for figures.
So what high school did you attend?
Putney School in Vermont. My parents were divorced in 1950, and they sent me there to boarding school for 4 years.
Can you talk a little
when
bit
they
about
split up.
what Putney was like?
Well, Putney was at that time sort of an infamous liberal school. It had a reputation for, well, boys and girls together, which is unusual in a boarding school in those days. The lady who founded it was a socialist, if not a communist, or that was alleged. It was very good, small, and actually rather controlling school that had that reputation.
And then where did you go to college?
Antioch in Ohio. That was another famous liberal place that had a 5-year work-study program.
So what did you study there, and then what kinds of work did you do when you were there?
Well, various. But when I got interested in film, there were film jobs, and if you were halfway competent, you got them. You got on a waiting list, and sooner or later you would do that. So it was terrific. Once I knew what I was interested in, I could go take part in it.
Okay, here's a question for you. What was the first time you saw television, and what shows did you see?
Oh, I was hoping you'd ask that.
And what was your impression?
Well, it blew me away. I like movies. This is when I'm probably 12 or 13. And on the Cape, TV didn't come early. It was 90 miles across Cape Cod Bay to Boston where the nearest stations were. And at that time, that was just on the bare edge of reception. And as I recall, the first TV I saw was a person on my paper route who lived at the highest hill in the town of Brewster, and indeed had built a tower on top of that so that his antenna was high enough to get Boston TV stations. And they were very nice, and I would deliver their paper and they'd invite me in. The problem was, of course, I wouldn't leave. And the rest of the paper wouldn't get done until long after dark, if then. So I reorganized the paper route. I remember that. It was a big problem-solving exercise, but I managed to lay it out so that this was the last house I got to, not in the middle of my route. And I'd just go in there and stay until my mother called. She knew where I was and what I was doing.
What was on? What were you watching?
That's harder to remember. I wanted to see movies. I didn't want to see, a couple of people in front of a piece of cardboard telling jokes. Anything was sensational, but Hopalong Cassidy was about the most action-filled thing. Martin Caine, Private Eye, was the pipe tobacco sponsor. I can't remember. It was like that. And then there was a man reading the news from Boston, in WBZ. Those are the ones I remember.
Right. What was your first professional job, and what were your duties?
It was one of the Antioch jobs in St. Louis, working for Condor Films, who made sponsored films, so-called industrials. And I was just, a general assistant, do whatever I was capable of doing, which wasn't much at that point. A lot of errands, drive to and from the lab, that kind of thing.
So then, when did you work at Potomac Films?
That was another Antioch job later on, and by that time I had more to offer.
Now, is that where you learned, where did you first get this idea of actually making films and editing them?
Well, in that period, but I was very lucky. I ran into John Cordy at Antioch, who was an extraordinary guy in the sense that he was already a filmmaker, and he had known, much earlier in his life that he wanted to do it, and he had started making animated films when he lived in St. Louis before he went to college. So by the time he got to Antioch, he was well along. And he inspired me. We got to be roommates, and then 5 of us set up a little company to make films. Was
that after school? After Antioch?
That was during Antioch. The beauty of work-study is that, every 3 months you'd stop studying and start working. And the boundary became pretty soft.
Can you talk a little bit about John Cordy?
Oh yeah.
Who he?
Well, he is a director and producer. In the early years, he made a lot of films of his own. Living in San Francisco, Stinson Beach, and I think Mill Valley. He made a film called Crazy Quilt, and Funny Man with Peter Bonnerts. A lot of very, very, for their time, advanced films, for which he had no lights. And then, he's been doing a lot of mainstream television since. I think the autobiography of Jane Pittman is probably the major one that most people would know.
So, Nick, when did you come to Los Angeles? When did that happen?
During that job at St. Louis, our tape decks, big 17.5 millimeter magnetic tape drive things that you had to have to do sound, both quit. And my boss, who was in charge of all this equipment, figured it was cheaper and more efficient simply to put them in his car and bring them out here to Magna-Sync and have them rebuilt. So we put them in the car and we came out in 2.5 days from St. Louis, had 3 amazing days in Hollywood, went around, saw all the things, and then put the machinery back in the car and drove back, so home within a week. But I got a look at it, and it was pretty formative.
So then when did you come back? I mean, then is that where you got the idea?
Well, I sort of thought it would be a neat place to live. And I graduated from college. I went to work full-time for Potomac in Washington, doing industrials and educational films. Again, just assisting, doing what I could. Soon got the idea that Washington wasn't the place to be. Thought it's either New York or L.A. I had been to New York during the Antioch days trying to get jobs there, and had frozen to death and damn near starved. And I didn't find it a friendly place to be young and hopeful. So Los Angeles seemed to be it. So in 1960, I came out here for good.
How did you find work?
I had, my then father-in-law was with the telephone company and quite high up, done public relations for AT&T, and he had a lot of friends here, and he gave me their names, and I went to see them. And, I think it was probably a little subsidy, because I got some nice little jobs very easily. It just kept me going from week to week.
And then how did you meet up with David Wolper?
He was I was referred to him by one of the people I was talking about, but I can't remember which. And he was just one more flake among many. But I had an interview with him, and I started to work for him.
Now, what was the reputation at that time for David, Wolper Productions?
Zero. So I mean, it was all just happening. And I must say, it seemed very unlikely. I mean, it was exciting, but he was way down on my list of probable employers, because I couldn't imagine that he could go out and sell biography, real stories about real people.
What was his background? I mean, so what was his reputation before then?
Well, I learned that he'd been a very successful on-the-road salesman of syndicated TV, bad movies. Flamingo Films was an enterprise. He'd been all over the country and established himself as a salesman. And boy, that was just the beginning.
What was he like, personally and professionally?
He was refreshing, very direct. Struck you as not being very not being smart, but not very knowledgeable. I mean, he'd sort of say, well, yeah, who's this guy, this senator, if he was really, you could find out about him, but he was not highly cultivated.
So what was his function there?
He was the boss. I mean, he was the founder of the company.
And who were the other heads of the company? Can you describe them?
Well, it was Jack Haley, and I think soon after Mel Stewart, and then 2 years, maybe 1.5 years later, Alan Landsberg. Those were the 4 that really did it.
But now, who owned the company?
David.
And then what were Mel Stewart, Jack Haley, or Alan Landsberg's
They
jobs?
were executive producer. Jack was executive producer of Biography, and he made a bunch of specials there. Most of them before he started on Biography. Mel came out to do a series called The Story of, a live or a filmed documentary series. Alan came along to take over Biography when Jack got involved in other things. So they were all executive producers, under David, doing what needed doing.
Then what was your job?
My job, well, initially, I got a research paper to do on Robert Taft. And that's what I mean. I mean, here I was making a show for David about Robert Taft, and David didn't know who Robert Taft was. He found out, and, he knew what he had to know. So anyway, I did a paper for $100 in 2 weeks or so, brought it in. Jack had no grasp of what making a whole season, forget what a season was in those days, it was at least 26 shows. No idea what it was going to take. So I think there were maybe 5 of them, kind of making the series, kind of working on it, but in fact hadn't finished the first show. Weeks were flying by. So Jack was really in a continuing state of panic. So I brought this research paper back, and he said, well, that's great. And you get over to Grinberg and pull the film. And I did. And then I brought it back. And I still wasn't an employee. I remember trying to screw up my courage to ask Jack whether I had a job or what was the deal. And I did. He said, oh, yeah, oh, great. Go down and talk to Harvey, talk to David, make your deal. Lots of work to do here. So within 6 months, I think, I was making the Robert Taft show, and I was making an Amelia Earhart show. I had started an Edison show. I had started a Teddy Roosevelt show, and the rest was panic.
Now, what were all these shows for? What was the series called?
Biography, the original biography.
And what network did it air on?
It was syndicated, and pretty widely. It was very successful.
And who sponsored it?
Various, I think banks, insurance companies, a lot of clients in those days wanted something kind of, we'll hold it for the plane. Okay. One sponsor leaps to mind was Chemical Corn Exchange Bank in New York, because we made a show about Franco, and the fellow you mentioned earlier, Al Ramris, who was a ferocious right-wing Ayn Rand follower, didn't pull any punches when he got to somebody like Franco. And the problem was that Franco had his escape money in Chemical Corn Exchange Bank in New York, and we heard about that right away. And we were told never to do that again. But, syndicated, how could you possibly know all the vested interests that were out there? But it gave us all a few bad moments.
Well, now, who was it? Jack Haley was in charge of the series.
Right.
And what was he like to work with?
He was great. He was an inspirational guy in many ways. Extremely good-natured, very, very social, great talker, storyteller, fair-minded, smart, knew a lot about a lot of things, particularly movies with his background. The only problem was he was nocturnal, and he really didn't turn up ready to work early to mid-afternoon. And he was only there then for 3 or 4 hours, and then he would have to go to dinner. And dinner was always something, out on the strip. And then he would come back, more serious about working, maybe 9 or 10 o'clock. And you were forced to go on to Jack's schedule if you wanted to work with him. And if you didn't, it's very possible you wouldn't get the job done, you wouldn't be around very long. So I can remember just many, many, many late nights with Jack. And I didn't suffer so much because I was writing or pulling film and so forth, but the editors who worked with him just had to go completely on the night schedule. And it was hard.
So, this had a big impact on your life.
Yeah, enormous. So in a very short period of time, I was able to do a lot of work with very good people, learn a lot.
Can you talk about what, were you the producer of this show? Of the Robert Taft show and then the other
Yeah,
ones you mentioned?
yeah.
And then can you talk about how much of it was compilation, how much, just kind of what your work involved on this?
It was compilation entirely, except for the opens and closes, which were, and the occasional interview that we did, but for the most part, it was made entirely of mostly newsreel film. And as I said, is that saw bothering you?
It's okay. It's okay.
I'm afraid it's going to be pretty much continuous.
Yeah, it's fine. We have.
And the major part of it was to write a script and pull a film and get the two together. Write mics, opens and closes, get them shot, get it all together in the editing room and take it to sort of an advanced rough cut with the editor. At which point Jack would take it and go off and make it good. And because of this nocturnal process, he would go, he had his own editor. I had the editor who was working on my show. At a certain point it would pass out of my hands, it would disappear. Participation wasn't discouraged, but it was between 9 and 3 o'clock in the morning, so mostly you didn't see what happened. About a week later, Jack would give it back to you much, much better than it was before. And your job was to figure out how he did it.
So, now who was Mike that you mentioned? Was
Mike Wallace, who was host and narrator.
For the entire series?
For the whole series.
And what did you think of his work on it?
Tremendous. He was very much involved. He was rarely there, but on the phone. You would do the script, send it to him, he would come back. He'd have many, many notes. He would do a rewrite, call him again, and so forth. He didn't like saying anything that he didn't think was correct.
So how would you assess your creative control on these projects?
How?
Your creative control, and that kind of handoff process.
Right.
How did that work for you?
Well, because it made the show so much better, and very well in the sense that eventually I saw what Jack was doing, which is a lot of fine-tuning, and led to, a life in the editing room for me, because
I mean, these